They say that imitation is the best form of flattery. And in this case, there are 10 wrestlers that should be really flattered out there, as some gimmicks have been used by more than one wrestler. And no, I am not talking about passing down mantles, I'm talking about times where characters have been straight up ripped off, either as part of a storyline or, in one example, real life. Anyway, with that being said, this is the topic of today's episode, because today... Okay, before we begin, allow me to ask that you please make sure that you're a member of the Know-It-All Nation and help me get to my goal of getting that silver play button. Anyway, with that being said, let's get into the list. We might as well go ahead and start this list off with two of the most obvious answers that most wrestling fans are going to come up with. With Scott Hall and Kevin Nash leaving for WCW, this left an obvious gap in the WWF, and it would be filled by someone who went the other way. Jim Ross, after leaving WCW for the WWF, would have an off-again, on-again relationship with the company, before eventually using these releases as part of his heel persona. But the most noteworthy thing that came out of Jim Ross's awful stint as a bad guy would be the time that he brought back a version of the bad guy, as well as a version of Big Daddy Cool, when he introduced a fake Razor and a fake Diesel to the WWF audience. Now, the alternate Razor was played by Rick Bogner, who, after Jim Ross's heel turn was mercifully ended, would go back to wrestle in Japan, where he would, interestingly enough, join their version of the NWO. And as for the fake Diesel, well, he would be played by one Glenn Jacobs. But we'll be getting back to him in a little bit, and we'll also be talking more about the NWO too. But before we do that, well, let's get into the next entry. Did you like the original Mortal Kombat? Well, I sure did, and one of the coolest features of that game just had to be the mirror match, and it seems like somebody in WWF must have agreed with me. After being written off TV to deal with injury, Mark Calloway, the real Undertaker, would take a bit of a hiatus, only for the next appearance of the character to be portrayed by someone else, namely Brian Lee. The Undertaker was brought in by Ted DiBiase, who did bring in the Phenom in the first place in the WWF. At any rate, eventually Calloway would return, leading to a mirror match at SummerSlam, where of course the OG would come out on top. Now, even though Taker knows what it's like to get his identity taken, it doesn't mean that he hasn't done it to someone else, because he has, such as... That's right, Kane once had his identity stolen from his very own brother. Just goes to show you that you can never be too safe, and that you should probably protect yourself, like with the sponsor of today's video, Aura. Alright, so this list is all about wrestlers who had their identity taken, but you know what? It affects more than just wrestlers, and it affects more than kayfabe, as this happens all the time in real life, which is all the more reason why you should protect yourself with Aura. Aura is identity theft protection. It's also fraud monitoring, as well as a VPN and a password management service, as well as antivirus software, all rolled up in one conveniently easy to use app. You're more vulnerable than you think. It gives you near real-time alerts on things like credit inquiries, or if someone's trying to open up a loan in your name. And if you use my affiliate link down in the description, you get a 2-week free trial, so there's no reason not to give it a shot, as it really is a tremendous service, and it does help me out a lot. Anyway, with that being said, let's get back into the video. Not only did Kane's big brother once don a red and black costume, but so did Luke Gallows. Now, allegedly, the plan here was supposed to be that Gallows was going to replace the Big Red Machine, with it being reported that Glenn Jacobs was considering stepping away from wrestling, and as such, Jacobs would be written off, with the angle being that Jacobs was an imposter, and had been the entire time, with the kayfabe story being that the covered Gallows was the true Kane, even though of course in real life Jacobs was the original. But almost as soon as this angle debuted, fans just hated it, which resulted in WWE dropping the storyline just about as fast as they could. Which is perfectly understandable when an angle isn't doing too well. However, I do have to say, I don't think this was the worst idea in the world, although that wig that Luke Gallows was wearing was almost as bad as Woody Harrelson's in Venom. Oh, but speaking of ridiculous clown wigs, that leads me to... Okay, so there have been a lot of wrestlers who have played Doink throughout the years, and I'm not going to go over all of them, but here are just a few highlights. At this point, it almost seems like it'd be easier to name all of the wrestlers who weren't Doink, as it seems like almost everybody in the WWF has played a clown. at least sometimes. Now it all starts with the real Doink, Matt Bourne, who was also succeeded by Ray Apollo, but there were other substitutes as well, such as the Brooklyn Brawler Steve Lombardi, and also Nick Dinsmore, aka Eugene. And that's not even mentioning that weird Survivor Series team of Men on the Mission and the Bushwhackers. Furthermore, there have also been a few official Doinks to appear in the Independents as well as the National Wrestling Alliance, as portrayed by Dusty Wolf and Ace Darling, who as Doink even got to compete in an NWA World Heavyweight title tournament. And most recently, Doink also made another appearance during the Money in the Bank 2020, and we should also point out that there was another wrestler in the modern era who dressed up as the famous clown. Okay, so to switch things up a bit, instead of having a wrestler that other wrestlers impersonate all the time, here we have a wrestler who does the impersonating himself. And quite a lot at that. For a non-masked, non-face painted wrestler, Chris Jericho has sure made a hobby out of this. Not only did Y2J also play Doink among the many other wrestlers that we just covered, but he has also dressed himself up as Pentagon Jr., doing so at the original All In pay-per-view, the precursor to AEW. Also, back in 2016, Jericho sat in the front row of Monday Night Raw dressed up wearing a Sin Cara mask. Also, this wasn't Jericho's only time masquerading in the front row, as he also portrayed that of a Rey Mysterio fan in order to jump, well, Rey Mysterio. And while it wasn't exactly an identity swap, he did also get to play the brother of Jushin Thunder Liger named Super Liger. And going back to that whole Sin Cara mask thing, well, that leads us to the next entry. Originally wrestling in Mexico as Mystico, the first Sin Cara would end up serving a wellness policy violation during his initial run with the WWE, and at this time the higher-ups in the House of McMahon decided that he would get a replacement, and it would be one in the form of his former rival, Hunico. And then, upon the original's return, the two would enter a feud yet again, but this time it would be over the right to wear the mask, and with that, Mystico won. However, he would eventually be released by WWE, and as such, Hunico would yet once again take on the role, making him an imposter twice over. And us fans were all supposed to pretend like we didn't notice that that tattoo had just magically reappeared. Alright, so now, returning to the New World Order. You see, I told you we would get back to them. Back in 1996, the New World Order had just begun and were running wild. With every time you turned around, it seemed like a new member was joining their ranks. And one such wrestler would be none other than the man they call Sting. At least, so it seemed. Portrayed by wrestler Jeff Farmer, the NWO used a fake Sting in order to create some confusion in Camp WCW. This all came to a head at Fall Brawl in the War Games match, where the real Sting would come out to reveal that him and the fake Sting were two different people, and this would begin Steve Borden's transformation into the Crow Sting. However, as for Farmer, he would continue portraying the NWO Sting even in Japan, as well as in the independent scene until 2005 when he retired. But then, years later, when Sting finally joined WWE at WrestleMania, the NWO would help Sting like they were friends the whole time. For reasons. But this wouldn't be the only time that someone pulled this trick on Steve Borden, as Barry Windham dressed up like Sting at Halloween Havoc 1990 in order to try to give Sid Vicious a bogus win over the then champion. However, the referee would not be fooled, and Sid's victory would be overturned and the match would be restarted, with the real Sting coming out on top. While there are 3 faces of Foley, there are also multiple faces of Phineas, one of which is also a face of Foley. Aside from playing Phineas Godwin as well as Midian and, well, naked Midian, wrestler Dennis Knight would take on yet another mantle, the mantle of Mankind, as he appeared as a fake Mankind standing face to face with one Mick Foley on an episode of SmackDown. Now, this angle would ultimately lead, well, nowhere, as it really wasn't all that important, but it just goes to show that WWF really had no idea what to do with Dennis Knight. Not saying that I would know what to do with him either, but it doesn't matter because apparently he's a very accomplished chef right now, so everything worked out in the end. Alright, so now think of this as something of a lightning round, as I'm about to mention a bunch of examples, all leading to the same exact practice. A case of twin magic has happened many times in WWE, or at least sibling magic to say the least, with a handful of wrestlers using their brother or sister in order to fool either the referee or their opponent, or both. Now, I'm not going to go over every single time that this has happened, but just a few noteworthy examples would be Dave and Earl Hebner, when Earl would take a bribe from Ted DiBiase in order to replace his brother Dave and cost Hulk Hogan the title in his match against Andre the Giant. Also, while they may not be identical twins, Kurt Angle did have his older brother Eric sub in for him during a match at Survivor Series 2000 against the Underbiker, where Eric would eat a last ride powerbomb and begin to take the pin before the referee noticed that it was Eric and not Kurt, thus allowing a distraction for the Olympic gold medal hero to run on in and steal a victory. And in addition, we of course just have to mention the Bella twins, Nikki and Brie, as they are undoubtedly the masters of this strategy, because as good as they are, they're still not flawless, as Brie has lost Nikki's championship to Layla at Extreme Rules back in 2012. Alright, so now it's time for a gimmick that has been straight up jacked, and I'm not talking about as part of a storyline, I'm talking about in real life. Tom Brady has wrestled as multiple names, such as Salvatore Sincere in the WWF. However, apparently that wasn't enough because he decided to also straight up steal the gimmick of one Del Wilkes, aka the Patriot. With Wilkes retiring in 1998, Brady decided to take on the mantle, and he's still doing it even today, with over a quarter of all of his matches being as the Patriot. However, the problem is Wilkes never signed off on allowing Brady to use the gimmick, and apparently there's no way that he can stop him, with ownership of the actual character being in a state of flux, as it's not really clear who actually does own the gimmick, with, surprisingly enough, the Honky Tonk Man claiming that it's actually his, having his own son play the character to boot. Oh, and going back to Brady, he allegedly uses pictures of Wilkes at autograph signings. Well, there you go, 10 imposters in professional wrestling. What are some more you could think of? Let me know down in the comments, and please make sure that you're a member of the Know It All Nation by subscribing to this channel. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you to my amazing Patreon supporters. And as always, Dave knows.